In this lesson, we're going to look at reflexes. Before we get into the reflexes themselves, though, we're going to look at how we can voluntarily move our body. So voluntary movement itself begins in the motor association area of the brain, and it then travels down, as we can see these motor nerve cells moving down through the brain and through the medulla oblongata. We can't really see the medulla oblongata here. It's as we continue down through the midbrain, through the pons, we eventually make it here to the medulla. So it's at this point that I'm just going to change my pen color, okay, and I'll show the highlighting or highlighting here. And we can see that during the medulla, we've actually now crossed from the left hemisphere and we've moved over to the other side. Okay, we've switched sides. Now, this movement itself, it integrates with the cerebellum in order to provide a really smooth control of movement. So that was back in our lesson on the brain and the central nervous system. So this impulse then continues and it travels all the way down through the spinal cord. So if I continue that here, and as it passes down through the spinal cord, it synapses eventually with a motor neuron. That motor neuron is then going to carry on its effect to a particular effector. Now, an example of a very basic, not reflex necessarily, but just voluntary movement and process involves the following steps. We have a stimulus, a receptor, a modulator. We then go from our modulator and we're going to have an effector, a response. Okay, so if we start at the top with just this example here, the stimulus could be a teacher writing notes up on the whiteboard. Now, what is going to detect this change in the environment? Well, it will be the photoreceptors in the eye, and they're going to send an impulse along a sensory nerve, and that's going to carry that impulse to the central nervous system. Now, in this instance, we're looking at vision, and when we're looking at vision, the information is going to arrive at the occipital lobe, okay? And you might even have an impulse sent to the frontal lobe, okay? Then an impulse is going to be sent along the descending tract of the spinal cord, along a motor neuron, and it's going to travel to the muscles in the hands and the fingers. Why the hands and the fingers? Well, if the teacher's writing notes on the whiteboard, we are going to want to copy those notes from the whiteboard. And so the effector is the muscle in our hands and our fingers. The response, however, is what we actually do with that. So the response in this case is we are typing or writing our notes. So stimulus, receptor, modulator, effector, response. The stimulus is the change. The receptor is the thing that detects the change. The modulator is the thing that interprets the information and provides a response. It will send it to an effector. The effector moves, and then we get our response being the actual final outcome here. So let's talk now about how we can apply this to reflexes. So some keywords for us to describe reflexes. Firstly, rapid. They happen very quickly. They happen without you thinking about them. They are involuntary. And the third keyword that I'm going to write here is that they are stereotypes. They happen in the same way every single time. Now, when we're talking about reflexes, it's very important that we understand that the purpose of a reflex is to protect the body from harm. So some reflexes are controlled by the unconscious part of the brain, so our autonomic nervous system, but most, and the really important ones for us today, are those controlled by the spinal cord, and they're what we refer to as spinal reflexes. So here are those words again. Really important that we have these 4 key properties outlined. So reflexes require a stimulus, okay? Number 2, they occur without conscious thought, they're involuntary. There are only a small number of neurons involved, so their transmission is really rapid, and they occur in the same way each time. Okay, that was a typo from me, apologies. They occur in the same way every single time. So when we're talking about a reflex arc, and we mentioned that some are under autonomic control and some are under the spinal control, what we're going to be looking at today is what we call a reflex arc. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at a spinal reflex arc. So what is this? Well, a reflex arc is a pathway where a nerve impulse is going to move from receptor to effector. Okay? And a spinal reflex arc is one that involves the spinal cord itself. So these are our key steps. You remember these from earlier. Number one, we have our receptor. Our receptor detects the stimulus. It sends a message along a sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron then synapses in the spinal cord. Okay, so there is a synapse in the spinal cord, and that synapse in the spinal cord can either go directly from a sensory to a motor neuron, or it could also pass through an interneuron. This then passes on to our motor neuron, which carries the impulse to an effector, and the effector is ultimately going to receive the impulse and coordinate the response. So this here is a very quick look. We can see that we're going to have in our skin up the top of this diagram, number one, a receptor, as it's indicated down the bottom next to the 1. Okay, but just to make it really clear that our receptor connects here, it travels along this sensory neuron, and it goes to the integration center. So I'll highlight it in green here. This is going to be the interneuron, and this is found within the spinal cord itself. It then travels out of the spinal cord, and it travels to the effector, where it's going to initiate a response. Now, here is an example of a spinal reflex arc. So the stimulus here is not hot objects necessarily, but the fact that we touch the hot objects. And what does this trigger? Well, number one, it triggers a pain receptor. And it triggers a pain receptor due to the intensity of that particular stimulus. So temperature is detected by thermoreceptors. However, pain receptors are triggered when the stimulus is very large and recurrent. Okay, so in the case of this finger, it detects the stimulus being the hot object, and it sends a message along that sensory neuron to the, what I've just highlighted in green on the previous slide, interneuron found in the spinal cord. That then travels to the motor neuron. Ultimately, the motor neuron then synapses with the neuromuscular junction, okay? And it is going to cause, let's say we've touched this hot object with our hand, it is going to cause the muscles in the arm to contract. That is the effector. Now, the muscles in the arm contracting is not the response. The response is withdrawing the hand from the hot object. Okay? So, if we have a look here, another example. Okay? Number one, pain receptors. So initially, stepping on something or placing your hand on something sharp, it might be a mechanoreceptor, okay? But due to the intensity of that stimulus, it triggers a pain receptor. The pain receptor then sends a message along the sensory neuron through the dorsal root ganglion to the spinal cord. Okay, so this is our sensory neuron conducting that nerve impulse to the spinal cord. It then meets in the spinal cord as it travels through one of the interneurons. This connects it out to one of the motor neurons, which travel out via the ventral root and to an effector. Okay, so this motor neuron has just carried that impulse to the effector. Now the effector, in the case of placing your hand on a sharp pin, pain receptors send that message, blah, blah, blah. We get to the end. The effector is your bicep muscle in your arm. It contracts and it pulls your hand away. So the response and the effector are two different things. The effector is the bicep muscle contracting. That is the effector. Then the response, which I'll highlight let's go back to yellow here. The response is removing the hand from that pin. Okay. So when we have a look here, we've got another example. This is the patellar tendon reflex over on the right-hand side. And what you can see is stretch mechanoreceptors are detected when the patellar tendon is stretched itself. This causes a stretch receptor found within the quadriceps to extend, which sends a message up to the spinal cord or along the sensory neuron. It synapses directly with the motor neuron, goes back to those quadriceps muscles which contract, and it forces this leg to kick outward. This here is, again, the same example from earlier where we looked at placing a hand on a sharp object, the bicep muscle contracting, but just a different diagram should you choose to go back through this one. But let's talk very briefly about feeling pain before we get into our final bit, which is just comparing a spinal and voluntary reflex. So when we feel pain, okay, the impulse that was originally present still travels to the spinal cord. However, it then continues up to the brain. The reflex itself is going to jump right back out of the spinal cord, okay, and it's going to go and action whatever the modulator has indicated. So in the case of us putting our hand on that pin, it's going to cause the bicep muscle to contract. But when we're feeling pain, what happens is that message still goes straight back to pull our hand away, but a message also travels up the longer route to our brain for interpretation. And this is why pain is often felt slightly after the reflex has already occurred. If we waited to feel pain, it would be too late already, and as a consequence of that, we are more likely to put ourselves in harm and danger. So the reason that we feel pain afterwards is so that A, we know that not to do that again, but also B, so that the reflex happens really rapidly to prevent further damage. Our last little bit from this lesson, we're just going to compare very quickly a spinal reflex to a voluntary response. So a voluntary response could be something like blinking, for instance, or moving your muscles, or a pain response. So in the case of a spinal reflex, they are really fast compared to a voluntary reflex, which is quite slow. The modulator in a spinal reflex is found in the spinal cord, not the spine, but the spinal cord, versus in a voluntary response, it is found in the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. In a spinal reflex, the distance that the message ends up travelling is quite small, as it only travels directly to the spinal cord and back out, versus in a voluntary response such as pain, it travels all the way up to the brain, so it's a little bit longer than what we see in a spinal reflex. Now the name gives it away somewhat, but a voluntary response is in fact voluntary. Spinal reflexes, we mentioned earlier though, are involuntary. Finally, spinal reflexes happen in the same way every single time, and by definition that makes them stereotyped. Voluntary responses, however, can vary depending on a whole bunch of different factors. So this has just been a very quick overview of spinal reflexes, how they work, and some of the key words that we need to know in order to adequately describe what we observe when we see them.